Well, good evening to you. It's Professor Jen. I'm recording to you at the beginning of spring break 2025. Good evening to you, and thank you to Captioning Services for everything that you do for us. So we can have a little coffee table series here, a little round table chat of sorts. So here we are in the syllabus. We're sort of in an interesting place, because I need sort of lead time in order to tape everything. And then, of course, Captioning Services does its magic. And I realize that some of our lecture casts, etc., podcast doesn't match exactly with where we are in the week, but that's okay because it gives us time to think about other things. So I want to share with you tonight some thoughts I have about Aesop fables. And of course, I would like to talk about the lion and the mouse. Certainly, what is the moral of the story, The Lion and the Mouse? Certainly, it's about kindness that's never wasted if you take a few minutes and you read about The Lion and the Mouse. It really has to do with being transactional, reciprocating, looking out for one another. I think about this, as I prepare for this class. I think about all of these situations that we find ourselves in as they relate to pop culture, things that are in the now. Why do we keep telling and retelling certain stories? And I spend quite a bit of time looking at housing, etc. You see this picture I have up for the week. It's an interesting little picture because it really is a tent encampment. Here we are right now, beginning of March. We keep talking about different weather changes, different parts of the country with different regions, and this very, very intense increase in the homeless populations. Why is this happening? Why are people who were 18, 19, 20, including persons from Silicon Valley who might be college graduates, 22, 23, 24, why are people finding themselves in current culture, living in tents, living in RVs, living off the grid, etc.? Why? Why? Because it's economics, because of status, because there are many persons who feel that it's, a badge of shame sometimes to have to go home. But we have these significant populations, the people that have been living homeless and houseless for many, many years, maybe even decades. Sometimes we think it is similar to Aesop fables, city mouse, country mouse, that maybe persons that don't have the experience coming from smaller regions into big cities, they maybe go in with too much confidence. They have uh, a less than educated view of budgets, what it costs to live in major cities. Maybe people will often say, gee, they didn't have the necessary sophistication to make it in a city. We can even look at it in the opposite. We say people from cities might go out to live, in a country setting, a rural setting, just like Aesop's country mouse, city mouse. And sometimes people are not prepared for that level of isolationism, or they're not prepared for being a homesteader, and they fail at these situations because we can be prepared for all of these different living, different relationships, different philosophies, why it is, that to talk about country mouse, city mouse, how it is that sometimes we find ourselves in situations in literature and real life, in film and music. We hear songs about people that have been transported, we could say, into other lifestyles, other customs. And sometimes we just don't know until we get there that it's just not what we had thought. It's not the right place. I think of Aesop fable often because we don't realize how far back we started personifying animals to tell the story. So we say, why is that? Why is it that we go to the woods and we tell the stories to children initially as an Aesop, and we tell it with, little critters and little animals because, the forest is usually thought of as our friends, just like when we move to someplace new, we see this new landscape or we see a vista and we say, oh, anything is possible. We go in optimistic. And then sometimes we find out, as we say in literature, we say in language nomenclature, we say, oh, this person is definitely, uh, a shark in sheep's clothing, you know. This idea that we use animals and little critters in nature from the forest really referential because they serve a particular purpose. We have a comfort in talking about animals ever since we're little kids, these little gentle critters in the forest until we find out otherwise. Back to city mouse, country mouse. Are we ever really prepared to make changes? I think the moral of that story happens to be also, are we ever really prepared to see differences? Are we ever really prepared to learn a different way to live? There's this interesting book, I might have referenced it before, I don't remember, but if I did, please pardon me. But it's a book by Andrew Solomon. In fact, it's on a banned book list right now in our country and it's called Far from the Tree by Andrew Solomon. It's a book about case studies of parents who have children that do very strange things, like the children commit crimes, or sometimes the children suffer terribly from mental illness and they refuse to take the medications, or maybe the medications don't work. And they're all little case studies of what parents have gone through in trying to help their children help themselves, you know, get used to this new landscape. There's this marvelous part in the book that sort of remind me a little of Aesop, the way Andrew Solomon tells it. And I'll give it to you, I'll give it to you in a summary. I'm also paraphrasing, but you'll get the point. So Andrew Solomon talks about the problem with parents, the problem that parents have. He says that parents often, wait 9 months to have this baby, right? To have this child. And we could even extend that through adoption, surrogacy, foster care, whatever, right? Parents are waiting for this child and they have all these hopes and dreams of how things are going to be in life, and they think about the best aspects of themselves. They say, oh, gee, I play ball really well, or maybe I cook and sew well, or I'm able to really have a nice garden. I was always good with memorizing different things. Parents always sort of think, oh, I can only hope that this child has, all of my best qualities. I really don't know many parents that turn around and say, gee, I hope my kid has all my worst qualities. Anyway, so Andrew Solomon says, parents go into this whole idea of parenting and having children with this fantasy in mind, this bucolic picture of how things are going to be, and part reality, part fantasy, part Aesop fable, part story. And he says, and sometimes we're very disappointed. We're very caught off guard. We're left in a situation we just don't understand. And this is what he put forth. He said, picture yourself as a parent in this situation, that for some reason all of your friends and you decide that you want to go on vacation to Mexico, and you save up all your money to go to Mexico, and you buy all of these great hot weather clothes in order to do what? Go to Mexico. And you learn some phrases so you can speak what? Spanish in Mexico. And you even cash in some of your money so you have the right exchange, you have pesos, etc. You study maps, the language. You even try some of the food ahead of time to see if you like the spices. And you get on this plane thinking that you're going to Mexico, right? You did all the right things, had all the right preparation. So Andrew Solomon says, the author, he says, and then you're mid-flight and nobody tells you that the plane is making a diversion. and that it's going in the direction, say, of Alaska. But nobody tells you that. So the plane lands and you get off the plane and you don't see Mexico. You see no ocean with, blue waters. You see no shells, no kinds of starfish, no nothing. Instead, you see igloos and you see all kinds of whale and you see all kinds of fish cooking outside, maybe curing salmon. And the language sounds nothing like what you were prepared for in Mexico. And it might even sound like Inuit, you know, and you're freezing, you're in your Mexico clothes, and you really need something that's much warmer, sort of like Rochester and -5 degrees. You need that. You don't have that because that's not what you were prepared for. So I think to myself, when I think Aesop, when I think, country mouse, city mouse especially, I think, boy, sometimes we really think we're prepared. Sometimes we really think we know what's coming next. So Andrew Solomon in this book, Far from the Tree, he says, and now you expect these parents to be happy that the rest of their life is going to be in Alaska, even though they planned for a trip to Mexico. But then they find out that everybody else that they knew went to Mexico. They love Mexico. They think Mexico is great. Best place they ever went, but they're really still stuck in Alaska. It's sort of like the moral of the story, don't count your chickens before they hatch. That kind of thing. Country mouse, city mouse, how we have to learn how to be, adaptable, that things come to us and we're just really not sure until we're in it. I think about swimming in the ocean. I don't know if any of you have ever been in an ocean. I'm sure half of you have. Maybe the other half of you have been in a lake, like a big lake, a great lake. Sometimes in the ocean, if you have this experience with riptides, the undertow, you can walk out like a half a mile. And one time I lived in Florida and we would keep walking, like, I mean, really walking like a half a mile out into the ocean, and we would still have water up to our waist. We would say, oh, we have this, that phrase, oh, I got this. I hate that phrase. We would say, oh, I got this. Then all of a sudden the undertow would come, and then all of a sudden we don't got this. And now you're dragged out in the middle of the ocean, much farther than you were supposed to be. You can hear, all kinds of shouting from the lifeguard to swim back in. That's if you can or you can't. Doesn't matter at that point because you're at the mercy of the ocean. You start hearing all of the horns being blown that you've gone too far. And you have to figure out a way to get back. You have to figure out a way to paddle back. Sometimes I think in pop culture, in current culture, we don't talk enough about the fact that we sometimes have to be prepared for disappointment. We have to be prepared for things that weren't really told to us, but we have to be prepared to make these changes, to make these vital observations that perhaps things are a little different where we are, much different than from where we had planned. I think about children, say 1300, 1400, 1500, 1600, certainly in other countries that have a lot more history than we have just by time and centuries. The 1700s, the 1800s, 1900s here, children that maybe went through wagon rides to go cross country when they were settling the Great West here in the United States. Thinking about what they must have been thinking about, like all of this land, all of this expanse, getting used to things, maybe a lot different from where they came from. I think often I read sometimes this historical fiction all about these young children that spent like 2 months, 3 months in these little drawn carriages, with a little bit of covering with their belongings and their family. And they would go cross country, say from a rural area, and they would come to the big city because parents felt maybe in 1900s in the place of industrial industrialization, that there were more jobs, there was more security, more opportunity, schooling, healthcare, all the same things that we think about today in migration. Country mouse, city mouse, same thing, same concerns. Nothing's really left us. For those of you that are graduating shortly, you have these concerns. You say to yourself, oh, if I get a job in this place, where will I be able to access health care? How far will I be from my family? How far is the commute? I think that these were questions we always asked because all of us, really, probably from the beginning of mankind, I mean, I'm not an anthropologist, but common sense sort of suggests to me that we were always probably trying to figure out, will I last? If you think about questions that people ask themselves thousands of years ago in evolution, I would think that one question probably was, will I survive, right? That's like a universal question. Number two, will I last? Okay, is this going to be like a one-hit wonder, or am I going to be able to make it? I think to myself, an evolutionary process. Did we ask the question, where do I belong in topography? Do I belong country mouse? Do I belong city mouse? Where do I belong? I think maybe in evolution, we started to ask ourselves, similar to Andrew Solomon, Far from the Tree, what happens? I was prepared for this, had my heart set on this. What's going to happen if it isn't this and it becomes that? Think often in these situations when people take jobs, right? And like people take jobs, well-intentioned, and they get to the job and they say, oh, this is just not for me. I thought it was sort of like an Aesop. I thought it was for me. I did all the right things. I said all the right things. I became all of the right things, and I got here, and this is far from the right thing. What is the moral of all these stories, especially Aesop back in the forest again, with our little critter friends telling us all about the perils of maybe trust and distrust, the perils of what can happen when you have no other friends in the forest, or in other aspects of Aesop, a little bit of kindness goes a very long way. Back to this picture with this homeless encampment, I think to myself, a little bit of kindness goes a long way. How is it that we get people off the street and into homes or houses, dwelling shelters? How is it that we begin to move mass migration of persons that maybe, went through the forest metaphorically? Maybe they weren't prepared. Maybe what they were prepared for was not where they uh, happen to wind up. And they wind up in these situations that maybe seem temporary, but it's like quicksand, You try to get your footing, and the more you try to get your footing, the deeper in the hole you're going. I'll tell you what I'm thinking. So many people on campus this past week, I've been observing, they talk about what's going to happen if the Department of Education goes away, what's going to happen with loan collection, right? Student loans, the ability to get student loans, the ability to pay back student loans on a different schedule, etc. And I think to myself again of quicksand, how so many students, maybe the term started out one way, right? People take these loans and then midway through the flight, like Andrew Solomon, things change its course and we're just not prepared. So I think to myself, there are so many aspects of fairy tale, Aesop fable, that have to do with everyday life, that have to do with everyday media and news and how it is that we absorb news and we make it relational to our own lives. We say, oh, does this have anything to do with my life? Having a home, having a job, worrying about my finances, worrying about, the ability to get loans, etc. I think to myself, if in the time and place, 1500s, 1600s, 1700s, if people were concerned and consumed like we are today about the acquisition of places, things, etc., it might look like the same concerns that we have today. The only thing that's different is that we don't have, uh, what could we say? A country mouse perspective. We have all these creature comforts, where we have all this modernization and we want to stay current. We want to have all the goodies. And I think to myself, how hard is it today for the average person to maintain themselves? Like we've been saying last 20, 30 years that most families are like two or three paychecks away from being homeless or evicted or in foreclosure. I think to myself, what was it like in the land of fairy tales, in the land of very classic literature, certainly Aesop's? What were people's concerns? Maybe having enough food, right? Having enough blankets for these wagon cover rides across the country. Uh, Maybe having the right kinds of liquids, elixirs, antiseptics for some kind of health care on the road. Clearly they didn't have all these modern healthcare facilities that we have today, these drop-in medical facilities where we can get some kind of community care. So I think to myself that time and place is always so important, but I think that the questions that we ask ourselves in our personal evolution really haven't changed, Who will take care of me? Where will I get help? How will I fit in? What happens if I count my chicks, and eggs before they hatch? The idea of who will be extending me the kindness? How will I recognize, you know, a shark in sheep's clothing? All of these kinds of questions we continue to ask ourselves, especially in pop culture where we're faced with so many new avenues to show that, we're successful, we fit in, we're part of the cultural context, we've made it. So I really wondered to myself, should we be looking at all of these classic stories to remind ourselves really how vulnerable we all are, how easy it is to wind up in one of these tents or encampments, or to be fooled by somebody who looks like they're really here to help us, but they're really not, or to say, gee, I'll jump at the first opportunity somebody gives me because I have to have an opportunity, so I'll take it. But then I get there and I realize it's not what I had thought. So it's all these kinds of discussions that I say to myself, this is why these stories really seem classic and timeless because they really touch upon what I would say is the human experience. So I thank you for your time tonight. I hope you enjoyed our little roundtable discussion, lecture, etc. My little observations. I like to just bring to you some different ideas on how we can work a lot of these wonderful pieces that we know either from our own childhood. Maybe we've become reacquainted in this class with some of the works. Maybe you've never seen any of these works before. And it just gives us some thought as to why it is that these stories hang around for so many, many centuries and how we can apply it to everyday life today and our concerns, etc. So I wish you well. I hope you have a nice break. I hope you do fantastic things. Here in Rochester next week, it's going to be like 65 degrees. So I'm going to go and sit outside and get my steps in and really enjoy myself. And so I wish you well always, and I thank you for your time. Have a wonderful, blessed evening. Good night.